afternoon, everyone. Seems like you can hear me. Welcome to this final session of the day. My name is Emma. I'm from the University of Copenhagen.
And my name's Brooke, and I'm from the University of Sydney. And we just want to first of all start our talk tonight by saying we're going to get you out of here early. So just bear with us for probably a good 30 minutes, and then we will be out of here. But we do really have the incredibly big shoes to fill of Stephen Woloshin and Barry Kramer, who unfortunately can't be here with us in Oxford this year. But guided by their wisdom and some of their slides, we'll be presenting Preventing Overdiagnosis 12 Years On. And while 12 years ago, I was a very young, hearing about overdiagnosis for the first time, both Emma and I, too, in the short time that we have been working in this field, have seen the field change. And in the 12 years that this conference has been going, there's been some incredibly big changes. And we're also still talking about many of the things that we talked about at those very first conferences as well. So we hope that this short talk will give you some perspectives on the past, the present, and the future of preventing overdiagnosis.
And we're going to start off with a video from Barry and Stephen.
Hi, I'm Stephen Woloshin, and with Lisa Schwartz, I was one of the organizers of the first Preventing Overdiagnosis meeting back in 2013 in Dartmouth in the United States. That's where I am right now, but I really wish I could be there with you today in Oxford. This session is in part about history, so I want to take a moment to tell you a bit about the first meeting and how it came about. Lisa and I had the great fortune to study and work with extraordinary thinkers and researchers like Bill Black, Jack Wenberg, and Gil Welch, who opened our eyes to the problem of overdiagnosis and encouraged our work and supported our work in the field. Most of our work and most of the work in the area focused on cancer and cancer screening, how well-meaning efforts to find early disease can lead to diagnoses that can't help because the disease was never destined to progress. So they can only harm. They can only hurt people physically, psychologically, and financially. That's the problem of overdiagnosis. But Lisa and I, in addition, saw a parallel beyond cancer and how changing disease definitions can have the same bad consequences. We wrote a paper about proposed changes at the time to lower diagnoses for thresholds for diabetes, hypertension, cholesterol, and obesity, and how this created millions and millions of new patients. But we couldn't know whether they would benefit from these diagnoses or experience net harm. That was an open question. Now, as many of you know, publishing research papers is sometimes anticlimactic. You put in months, maybe years of work into a project, and then nothing happens. But not this time. This time, something wonderful happened. What happened was that Ray Moynihan, the great Australian journalist and researcher, read our paper and reached out to us. And that led to years of collaboration and a lot of fun. Most relevant to today, Ray ultimately pitched the idea of an international conference about overdiagnosis. And the three of us worked together to develop the meeting's goals, to build a research agenda, to foster global networking, and to raise public awareness. Back in 2013, we had no idea if anyone would actually show up for a meeting about overdiagnosis. It was still a niche concept. Someone put it like this: when word gets out that you study something counterintuitive like overdiagnosis, all your friends think you're a weirdo, and all the weirdos think you're their friend. But the meeting was a big success. We had over 250 attendees from over 20 countries, and the momentum that began led to partnerships with Oxford, British Medical Journal, and others. 12 years later, here we are. Thank you so much for being part of this. I want to thank Oxford's Center for Evidence-Based Medicine for hosting us, to Wiser Health, the Dartmouth Institute, and the British Medical Journal for their support. And I want to give a special thanks to Ruth Davis, who manages everything behind the scenes. Ruth is a colossus, and we wouldn't be here today as a meeting or as an organization without her. So thank you very much, Ruth.
And I guess we have to replay the video for Ruth because I don't see her here, but thank you, Ruth. To a short video from Barry as well.
I'm sorry that I can't be at this year's meeting in person to join this session on the past, present, and future of the field of overdiagnosis research. I suppose I'm the designated ghost of POD past. In that capacity, perhaps I can provide my perspective on our field over the last several decades. In my view, there have been several major areas of evolution. Early on, researchers were working in isolation. For example, when delving into the literature on cancer screening in the early 1990s, I came across scattered, rare references to cancer overdiagnosis, a concept that was counterintuitive and usually discarded by cancer clinicians and researchers, but an eye-opener to me. All that changed just over a decade ago when a few like-minded healthcare investigators launched the first Preventing Overdiagnosis conference in 2014. POD brought a broad range of attendees together from a wide spectrum of healthcare fields, for example, oncology, psychiatry, cardiology, gynecology, rheumatology, dentistry, and others. It became obvious that there were core commonalities across diverse areas of specialization, including the practice of disease mongering. A second major area of evolution has been clarification of the core meaning of overdiagnosis, moving from a collection of conflated phenomena variously labeled overdiagnosis to a standardized definition formalized in a medical search heading or MESH term in 2021, thus improving literature searches in our field. A third area of evolution in the field has been the expansion beyond the early dominance of primarily descriptive studies, adding interventional studies aimed at actively decreasing the incidence or harms of overdiagnosis. And finally, the most gratifying change to me in our field has been witnessing the enlarging group of early-stage investigators to take up the baton for future advances. Many of them are at this conference, and in that regard, it's fitting that Emma Graham and Brooke Nickel chair this session and lead the discussion on the future of the field. Enjoy the session.
So like Barry, I'm the designated ghost of the past of preventing overdiagnosis. And I guess we really just want to start with how the transformation of medicine over time. And medicine has really transformed from treating symptomatic disease, so diagnosis management of symptomatic disease, to screening for early asymptomatic disease, to screening for risk factors of disease, to screening for risk factors of disease. And now we're even seeing companies and even social media influencers marketing normal human experience to diagnose healthy individuals, to sell products to consumers directly. And all of these are overdiagnosis generators. And this graph shows the transformation of medicine over time, where screening or looking for a disease when there is not one physically present, such as the case of cancer, can lead to widespread overdiagnosis and harm. And as a result of this transformation of medicine, it has really left us in a place where, sadly, according to this, we have very few well people left. And historically, overdiagnosis was conflated with misdiagnosis, so too much diagnosis or an incorrect diagnosis. And while this confusion still exists in society today, in the late 20th century, a distinction became more apparent between misdiagnosis and overdiagnosis, and that really began to emerge through screening and CT scans and MRIs, which were detecting small cancers, and through the concept of disease mongering, so exaggerating and creating these new diseases to expand commercial markets for tests and treatments. And as both Barry and Stephen noted, It really began with researchers and clinicians internationally beginning to think about this problem and document it individually across different areas, but mostly focused on the issue of cancer and cancer screening. And this really arose from the evidence-based medicine movement, where they were applying scrutiny to cancer screening and looking at that problem from that context. And a large focus was on identifying and describing the problem. And the definition of overdiagnosis really did start with this strong focus on overdetection as a result of this very prevalent concept around cancer. But now it has emerged to a more of an overdefinition, which Emma will allude to in her slides later on. And moving from cancer screening, we did really start to begin to see this concept of overdiagnosis of non-cancer conditions. So like Stephen said in his opening address, him and Lisa wrote a paper looking at overdiagnosis in diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, and overweight in the late 90s. And then there was a book by Ray Moynihan and colleagues on selling sickness and disease mongering. And these books really set the stage for some of those conditions that we're looking at today, including ADHD. And it did set the stage for the investigation of many other conditions as well. Importantly, this very prevalent condition of motivational deficiency disorder.
We'll see you again now in 4 weeks, and please let us know if there are any problems in the meantime.
Thank you.
Okay, Ray. The condition varies from very mild. There are people who perhaps notice a slight reluctance to get out of bed on Monday morning at the mild end of the spectrum, through to the most severe disease, which is potentially fatal. These are people who find themselves at times in an acute attack, unmotivated to breathe, and these people will die.
And this disorder was being diagnosed by this one simple yet concerning 4-question diagnostic screening test, as you can see there up on the screen. Sure, most people in this room would be diagnosed with that. But in all seriousness, this early parody about the issue of disease mongering did and continues to highlight a critical aspect of overdiagnosis, the creation of these new diseases and therefore interventions in the pursuit of profit. And around 2010 to 2012, the topics of overdiagnosis started to becoming mainstream, with key leaders writing seminal books and papers, and there was a clear movement with a large interest emerging in the topic internationally. And as Stephen said, it was really his paper and his connection with Ray Moynihan that started these Preventing Overdiagnosis conferences. And a few days before I hopped on the plane to head over here to Oxford, I was talking to Ray, and he told me there was a magical phone call that happened on the Gold Coast of Australia between himself, Alex Barrett, Paul Glasio, with Steve and Lisa in Dartmouth, and Fiona Godley, who was editor-in-chief of the BMJ at the time. And they decided on that phone call that an international meeting was needed, and that Stephen and Lisa decided to take charge and held the first one in Dartmouth in 2013 with support from the BMJ and Consumer Reports. And as Stephen did note, there was 250 delegates who turned up to that conference from over 20 countries. And that was really the beginning of where we are today. And as I said earlier, although much has evolved, much has also stayed the same, and we've been talking about many of the same things. But it is a really exciting field to be a part of. And I think the most exciting thing for me has been the evolving advertising that we've had of the conferences from that early 2013 conference in Dartmouth. And following that conference, there's been 9 successful conferences over 11 years. And I watched a YouTube clip in preparing this talk today where Stephen gave the opening address at the 2013 meeting at Dartmouth, noting that there were delegates from 6 of the 7 continents. And I think we are still looking for someone interested in the topic of overdiagnosis in Antarctica. So we're putting out the word again, 12 years on. If anyone knows anyone, please bring them in 2026. But this conference really has been, as Barry noted, international and multidisciplinary from the start, and it really continues to be. And the conference has had some key partners over the years who, like Carl noted in his opening address yesterday, really came together as a bunch of well-meaning, passionate individuals and groups interested in preventing the problem of overdiagnosis. And along the way, there have also been some quite impressive partners that have supported the mission of preventing overdiagnosis. But what is really unique to this conference compared to other conferences is that there has been no financial support or financial ties. And that is something that has been an important aspect of this conference throughout. So while you might all not be going home with a fancy goodie bag tomorrow from a large MRI screening company, I do personally think we also need to thank Ruth for being able to find a way for us to all have a few drinks at every conference each year.
Thank you. And I was designated to speak to the present and really how the field of overdiagnosis has expanded. And I think all of us who are here today, we either if we're doing research on overdiagnosis or if we're working with the concepts in guidelines or in practice, we really stand on the shoulders of these people that Brooke just mentioned. And I think it's safe to say, and I can speak on behalf of all of us, that they still continue to inspire us in the work that we're doing today. So although I said that I was gonna move to the present, I, however, want to start off by showing this picture of Lisa Swartz's lecture that she gave at the very first conference in Dartmouth. And here she shows a graph showing the expansion of the medical literature of overdiagnosis. And as we can see, leading up to the point of the first conference, the body of literature on overdiagnosis has really been on the increase. And I updated this figure for how it looks today. Didn't manage to make it as nice as hers, but here it is. The two first mentions I just want to point to as well, because they echo some of what Brooke said, that a common inflation of overdiagnosis is misdiagnosis. And the two first papers here, one more than 100 years ago and the second in 1961, was really about the early detection of tuberculosis. And they found that we were creating too many diagnoses, that sometimes we would diagnose tuberculosis without the actual presence of a tuberculosis bacteria. So what we today would classify as misdiagnosis. And then the part of the graph that Lisa showed us, where it grows leading up to the first conference, and really since then there's been a growing number of papers each year published here in Medline on overdiagnosis. And then what's really impediment to any expanding body of literature or medical literature is a systematic and reliable assessment of that literature. So it was for this reason that Stephen and Barry proposed a mesh term and got it accepted in 2021. And a key goal, as I said, was to improve the reliability of literature searches and overdiagnosis, but also to perhaps stimulate more conceptual or enhance the conceptual understanding of overdiagnosis, like so we can agree on what is it, and perhaps also a consensus, so we are more likely to agree on what we mean by overdiagnosis. And I'm just going to read you the mesh term. It's or the mesh term definition of overdiagnosis. It's the labeling of a person with a disease or abnormal condition that would not have caused a person harm if left undiscovered. Creating new diagnoses by medicalizing ordinary life experiences or expanding existing diagnoses by lowering thresholds or widening criteria without evidence of improved outcomes. Long sentence. Individuals derive no clinical benefit from overdiagnosis, although they may experience some sort of harm. And so together with Karsten, we did a review of all of the citations that are indexed under the mesh term in PubMed on overdiagnosis. And the goal of the review was really to kind of map the body of literature post the development of the mesh term, as well as characterize the use of the term and what kind of studies are published on overdiagnosis since the mesh term introduction. And really echoing what Brooke said, there's been, overdiagnosis has expanded widely just beyond cancer. So in the past, since 2001, these are all the conditions in which overdiagnosis was described since the mesh introduction. Well, we see that there's metabolic and endocrine diseases like diabetes, obesity, even hormonal deficiencies, cardiovascular diseases, psychiatry like ADHD, and then in most recent years, we also saw a huge emphasis on overdiagnosis in women's health, including endometriosis and PCOS, and even expanding into whole new fields like you described last year at the conference, dentistry. But however, the majority of the citations that we identified was still on oncology, describing overdiagnosis in various cancer diseases. Screening was also the most prevalent topic, and what is notable is that 71.3% of the studies were somehow descriptive by nature, so describing overdiagnosis, and I think that's kind of might suggest that overdiagnosis is still in its formative stages, so the field of overdiagnosis is in formative stages where it continues to be relevant to describe overdiagnosis in new disease areas. However, we were also finding an increasing number of studies that either estimated overdiagnosis or that proposed interventions to prevent overdiagnosis or mitigate its harms, some of which we'll hear from Denise O'Connor tomorrow. And I think that really is testament to the fact that you know, the field of overdiagnosis is maturing to go beyond just describing the problem, but also handling the problem. And, but as I said, one of the aims with the mesh introduction was also to perhaps stimulate some conceptual consensus on what overdiagnosis means. So we compared all of the mesh indexed citations to papers that mentioned overdiagnosis but were not indexed pre the introduction. And what we found was there was a larger proportion of studies that actually used the definition of overdiagnosis according to the mesh definition in the mesh search. So there was 73 versus 50%. However, there was still 27% that used overdiagnosis to describe either misdiagnosis, false positives, and overtreatment. And this is like a service slide. So since there's no dedicated journal for overdiagnosis, we wanted to pull together a list of what are the top journals in which overdiagnosis research is published in. And these were the top 10, and these included our two partner journals, BMJ and BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine. And then moving on to the future, I want to talk a bit about what new fights and frontiers we might be facing and who might be our new friends in these fights. And neither Brooke, Stephen, Barry, and I are fortune tellers, so we thought who might be better to ask about the future than the early to mid-career researchers of preventing overdiagnosis. So that's what we did, and we asked them to prioritize the future. What are key areas of the future in terms of disease areas, topics, actions against overdiagnosis? I think we heard a lot about this already at this conference, and what we, Preventing Overdiagnosis, as a community and organization can do to support those efforts. So, this is a very busy slide, but this shows that at the top that oncology was still rated really high or as a high priority for the future. And I think, so as I said, most research on an overdiagnosis is already on cancer, but we continue to face new challenges, for example, new risk-based screening strategies or new biomarkers and even new screening tests, for example, the multi-cancer early detection tests. And then psychiatry was rated as a high priority by 74%. And I think that's kind of also shown in this year's conference program, where we see a high proportion of sessions and presentations in psychiatry. And then notably, free text responses, we didn't include this in our list, but free text responses was heavily emphasized on women's health and the presence to overdiagnosis in women's reproductive health, gynecological diseases, obstetrics, pregnancy, and pre- and postnatal care. And for research topics, screening and overtreatment was still rated as a high priority for the future. These are well-known topics to the overdiagnosis community, but potentially in the light of new preventative treatment options. Then there was number 2, artificial intelligence, and 77% rated health system sustainability a high priority of the future. And I think Dr. Mina Johansson really been the one to put that on the map for the overdiagnosis community. So it's good to know that people also rate that as a high priority for the future. And then for future actions, like what can we do to prevent overdiagnosis? What might we do to counter the harmful effects? And if we ask the EMCRs, it seems like everything is relevant, and we should be doing a little bit of everything. But some of the very top ones included increasing public understanding, for example, health literacy, exploring de-implementation efforts, and encouraging regulators to address misleading medical marketing, for example, on social media, and look to how the harms of that, or how that might lead to overdiagnosis. And free text responses was really heavily emphasized on doing interventions that resonates with policymakers and governments, asking for bolder regulation and stronger political responses in cases of overinflated benefits of disease awareness campaigns or early detection efforts. And then, now we got to point to ourselves and say, what can we actually do, not just in our research, but also as a community and as an organization. And here it was also emphasized that we even could engage policymakers in the work that we're doing, not just, and also in the conferences, create public resources, working together with journalists, other media experts to communicate the problems of overdiagnosis, collaborating with healthcare leaders and clinicians. And especially I want to point out that many of the early to mid-career researchers emphasize that we should be collaborating more with patients and consumers, that these perspectives are grossly lacking from the current overdiagnosis literature. And I think that was beautifully articulated by Elspeth this morning. And this was also stressed by many of the other EMCRs who were responding in this survey. Establish interest groups for subtopics. So for example, doing groups within preventing overdiagnosis that were even preventing overdiagnosis in psychiatry or in women's health, to maybe keep the community going in between conferences. Integrate overdiagnosis in education and curriculum, not just for medical students, but maybe also for journalists, etc. And host advocacy campaigns and initiatives. And to sum up, in the future we might look to women's health and psychiatry, to look for new challenges to combat in overdiagnosis. We might turn to new friends. Our new friends might be consumers and patients and policymakers. And we might also tune our attention into how AI and social media might drive further overdiagnosis. So while I think we both agree that we have made huge strides since the first conference in 2013, there's still heaps to do.
And so on behalf of Stephen, Barry, Emma, myself, and the entire scientific committee, we're just so happy that everyone continues to attend and is attending this year, and that we are all working in this very important area. So let's keep going to wind back the harms of too much medicine, and let's go eat, drink, and party now. Thank you.